Thank you all for joining us for today's event, the Reading Culture Advantage, Boosting Achievement Across the Curriculum. This is part 2 of a 4-session virtual book study of Dr. Margaret Merga's book, Creating a Reading Culture in Primary and Secondary Schools, A Practical Guide. My name is Susie Tonini. I'm the school library consultant for the Colorado State Library, and I'll be leading each of the 4 virtual book study sessions. Today's event is being recorded, and all registrants will receive an email with a link to the recording, as well as any resources shared during the presentation. So let's start off with a reminder of where we're going. What is our end goal? The purpose of this book study is to share research-backed strategies for promoting reading engagement and prepare you for executing this 9-step reading culture plan. The reading culture plan is my synthesis of Merga's first 4 chapters, and you can use the link on this slide to create your own copy. So how do we get there? Well, in our first session, we focused on the why. We grounded our learning in data and research, and we began to think about how to learn the unique needs of the students that each of you serve. Today's session is focused on the what. As we learned in chapter 1, there has been considerable research that has found positive effects of the individual practices featuring in a whole school reading culture. And today, we'll learn and discuss those individual practices. And sessions 3 and 4 will focus on the how. How do you execute the reading culture action plan? Let's get started. Today, it's all about the what. What are the practices that research shows promote reading engagement? Research-backed practices for promoting reading engagement fall under 10 main categories. These are the 10 key strategies for transforming a school culture into a reading culture. When you are at step 6 of your reading culture action plan, agree on strategies, these are the ones that you'll consider. And you can click anywhere on this slide to access a PDF so that when you are at the table with your reading culture team, you can have that list right in front of you. And while we have limited time to dive deeply into all of the individual practices, we are going to touch on as many as we can together today. Let's get started with strategy 1. Regular opportunities to read silently for pleasure. As we learned and discussed in chapter 1, there are multiple reasons for students to decline in recreational reading. And during our lightning polls, you all voted competing leisure pursuits, especially those screens, as a significant cause, which makes providing regular opportunities for silent reading at school a critical strategy for promoting reading engagement for all ages of students. But as Margaret writes in her 2019 article, 10 ways to get the most out of silent reading at school, research suggests silent reading opportunities at school are often canceled and may dwindle as students move through the years of schooling. And where silent reading opportunities still exist, their implementation may not be reflective of best practice, which can make the experience less useful for students, even unpleasant. And you can access the full article there. So what are best practices? In this PDF that you can access by clicking on either of the 2 images, I've recreated Merga's 10 ways to get the most out of silent reading, so it's easy to share with colleagues. And I know, if you're thinking, how do we fit one more thing into the school day? Don't despair. Incorporating regular silent reading for pleasure has been successfully implemented with excellent success by other schools. And we are going to learn directly from someone who has pulled that off. So Gabrielle Mace in session 4, she's going to talk us through her Just Read program and how she did this at her school. But first, I just want to touch on a few points of these best practices. Reading enjoyment is the focus. Student choice is paramount, and a distraction-free environment is important. Merga also emphasizes the importance of paper books and cites research that indicates that students can find reading on devices distracting and that screen-based reading is not preferred by most people. And while I agree that within the context of silent reading for pleasure at school that paper books are preferable, that doesn't mean that ebooks and audiobooks are not incredibly important resources in our library collections. Our digital collections are often the only way in which students can access books outside of school, and books with audio provide important accommodations for many students, especially students reading below grade level, students with a reading disability, students or kinesthetic learners who learn through movement, and students who have limited leisure time to sit and read. And I just was thinking about the question that we answered in Module 1 as our welcome question, what motivates you to read more? What are your barriers? And there were so many of us that rely on audiobooks to maintain our reading habits, and kids need audiobooks too. So that's my plug for not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We need both paper books and ebooks and audiobooks. Okay, moving on to strategy 2, supporting choice. Similar to what Julia Torres shared in Module 1, supporting choice is not just bringing students to the library and telling them to check out a book. It is intentional guidance through book talking, curated book displays and digital collections, creating systems and time for students to share books they enjoyed with one another, and more. Students are more likely to enjoy a book that has a topic that is of high interest and text that is not frustratingly difficult. And research shows that guiding students' book selection appears to counter students' waning interest in reading and promote their further reading development. So how do we do that? As librarians, as classroom teachers. So I created this PDF of Merga's strategies for supporting students' choice of reading material, and you can just access it by clicking on the image. I especially appreciate the question, are you balancing one-to-one matching with teaching the student how to independently choose an appealing book? Because we'll hear later on from Donalyn Miller, we don't want to create dependent readers. We don't want them dependent on their teacher librarian. We don't want them dependent on their classroom teacher. We want them to leave our classrooms with the skills and habits they need to be lifelong learners. Now, if you really want to deep dive into honing your reading advisory practice, I highly recommend following the work of Becky Spratford. She is a reading advisory guru, and she recently recorded a webinar for the Colorado State Library about her 10 rules of reading advisory. And you can use the link on this slide to access the entire recording. But I'd like for all of us to listen to this short clip when she talks about best practices for K-12 students.
But let's talk about children. I also volunteer at the school library at least one time a month. And one of the things we have worked on the years I've been there volunteering is this idea that when they come to the school library to check books out, they should be able to check out whatever they want. When I started there and my kids were going there, they are now out of college and in college. They would say things like, you can have 2 books, one has to be just right, and one can be anything you want. And we've changed that. There doesn't need to be just right anymore. The just right book they get assigned by their teacher. They come to the library to get it. It's based on a unit they're doing. That one's assigned by the teacher. They used to only get 2 books. They're now allowed to have up to 6 books for fun. That's amazing to let them have so many books. And there are no rules about what they can be. They can all be graphic novels. They can all be below their reading level. They can be whatever they want. They don't have rules. Why? Because coming to the library for your book to read for pleasure should not have rules attached to it. What are we doing, right? Why are we making them already think that the library has has rules? Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I was meaning to close the chat. That makes them stop having fun. It's been wonderful to do this. It's so great. I even heard a kid reminiscing, a 5th grader, about how much he loved reading Elephant and Piggy when he found it and how he was going to check it out. Hearing him reminisce about his childhood and Elephant and Piggy made me almost laugh out loud. I held it back. But the fact that he knew he could just go get it and relive that joy and there was no shame attached to it, think about the message we're sending.
I just love Becky. She has a ton of her work all over the internet. I have linked in her blog post, the 10 rules of basic readers advisory service. But in short, these are the 10 rules. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of them briefly. So Becky recommends using resources and collaborating with other reading professionals to learn about great books versus trying to read all the books. And I've included the next 4 slides for you to explore after our session. Just as a starting point, I know a lot of these resources will be familiar to many of you, but it's a starting point for exploring resources for learning about great books. So I'm just going to whisk through those. There's podcasts, videos, websites, all kinds of great stuff there. And I wanted to share 2 excellent examples of partnering with other reading professionals to source recommended books. Our public library colleagues are valuable partners. Connect with your public library. Ask what reading advisory resources have they created. For example, Jeffco Public Library created the staff list of 500 books to read before middle school. I think it's fabulous. You can click on it as well. It's available to you and it's linked into the slide. And you can create collaborations within your own district to source great books. In Jeffco Public Schools, a group of digital teacher librarians create annual guides of highly recommended books at the elementary and secondary levels. They create slide decks and they share it across the district and beyond. And again, all of these resources you can access right in the slide there. Okay, strategy 3, accessible and visible books. This is especially impactful for low-income students. More books in the home correlates with greater reading motivation. But international research shows the number of books in the home significantly decreased between 2008 and 2020. And that's why it's more important than ever for schools to ensure that students have regular access to high quality reading materials as part of their commitment to mitigating educational inequity. And strategy 3 closely aligns with strategy 4, investment in school libraries and collections. This visual represents the key benefits of a whole school reading culture. And a high quality school library collection is a critical strategy for providing access to reading supportive environments and resources. And in Colby's Sharp book, Game Changer, Book Access for All Kids, he addresses budget cuts to school library programs. Colby writes, the defunding of school libraries should concern us all. When we consider the need for critical literacy skills, the need for information literacy, and the important role reading plays in building empathy for and understanding of the world, it's clear we need our librarians more than ever. Cutting library positions and funding is short-sighted in light of our long-term goals to create an educated populace. I see some snaps. So how do we prevent budget cuts to school library programs or advocate for increasing funds? What we do is we share what it is that highly effective school librarians do, the research that shows how we impact student learning and what we teach. So the first video, what is a highly effective school librarian, is a 9-minute video that you can share with your stakeholders that summarizes the teacher librarian role and the research that shows that impact. The second video is a 1-hour webinar led by Lincoln Public Schools Library Services Director, Dr. Christine Hefner. And she shares the library curriculum that she and her district team created to showcase the vital instructional role of school librarians. It is such an incredible resource of lesson plans that are so thoughtfully developed. I highly encourage you to watch the webinar, access their resources. They're all open to all librarians. That is a big part of their mission, so definitely check that out. And the Day the Librarians Disappeared ebook is one of the many advocacy resources found on the Libraries Today website. So you can access all of those on that slide. And in her book, Merga provides a list of 40 research-supported practices that build students' reading engagement and literacy learning, all of which are in the wheelhouse of the school librarian role. For the next 3 minutes, I'd like for us just to pause and take a few minutes to read through the list. And I want you to be thinking about the things that you do in your practice, whether you're a librarian, whether you are a classroom teacher or a different role in education. And I want you to think about which one of these is a real strength of yours. And I want you to drop that into the chat. And I'm planting the seed now because during your campfire crew, during your small group discussion, I'll be asking you to share more about this strength and what it looks like in practice with your group members. So I'm going to start a timer. So go ahead and start reading through that list of 40. And again, if you could just drop into the chat, which one of those is a strength of yours? And that's something you'll have a chance to talk about later with your small group. Thank you for dropping these into the chat. I see reading aloud, books and hooks, reading aloud in book talk, using student recommendations to support collection development, positively promoting reading as a reward, read widely, including middle grade and YA books, modeling reading engagement, setting up book clubs. Oh, we have a lot to talk about. Running reading contests, encouraging peer reviews and recommendations, provide balanced and diverse collection with age and skill level appropriate choices. These are great. Keep them coming. Accessible hours, open library time in the morning has been fun. Oh, I know. I used to have a makerspace group in the mornings, and it was such a nice way to start the day. Mobile book libraries, book tastings, diversity in the collection, use student recommendations. Fantastic. All right, you keep going. I'm going to keep moving just because we have so much packed in today. And I promise you will have a chance to talk about this with our small groups. So strategy six is teacher modeling. And Merga cites staff who read as a key pillar in the development and maintenance of a school reading culture. And Merga highlights that school staff may be the only avid reading models in a student's life. This PDF is a summary of Merga's 10 ways to be a reading role model. And this is something, again, you can click on, access the PDF, and share with your staff, and it can inform your whole school strategies. And while these 10 are in no particular order, I definitely believe that number 1 deserves its top position. Talk about books in the context of fun. Strategy 7 is engaging parent and caregiver support. We talked about orphan responsibility and expired expectations in Module 1. And as we learned, parent support and involvement in their children's reading may decline or disappear after students learn how to read independently. And as educators, we can help parents and caregivers understand the important impact of their ongoing support. And there's so many different ways to do this. This could be a literacy night. This could be, sharing information like what I have on the screen. This is a PDF of basically what Merga's practical parent and caregiver tips are for encouraging reading engagement. Again, as a parent or caregiver, you'll notice a lot of the same themes. Keeping reading a fun, pressure-free activity, being a reading role model, visiting libraries regularly to allow children to self-select books. And again, as we touched on earlier, audiobooks are an important tool in our reading arsenal. Make sure parents and caregivers know how to access audiobooks from the school and public library so that this can be a strategy for enjoying reading time together while they're driving in the car or doing it tasks at home like cooking dinner. And audiobooks are also an important tool for adults with low literacy levels to share reading experiences with their child. Strategy 8 is talking about books. For example, book talks, author visits. I just learned that Kwame Alexander is visiting Suntaris High School in Boulder tomorrow. Peer recommendations. So many ways that we can get conversations going about books. One creative way are these posters that my good friend Amanda Samlin, she's the Regis Jesuit High School head librarian, she surveyed staff and she created a poster for each teacher and administrator to post outside of their classroom or office door. And so not only do these posters showcase the reading lives of staff, that modeling piece, but they can be a real catalyst for connecting students and staff with similar interests. Strategy 9 is creating and sustaining reading spaces. Modern school libraries are a hub of activity. Many have busy maker spaces. Many provide a space for small group learning. But along the same lines of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, it's important that school libraries maintain a zone or area for relatively quiet and undisturbed reading, and accommodations like noise canceling headphones for students who may really benefit from that to be able to read in that space. And finally, strategy 10 is reading loud. Similar to silent reading opportunities, shared reading opportunities, and that's something many of you mentioned in our chat, both in the early years of schooling and beyond, should be promoted as a beneficial practice of building a reading culture instead of a peripheral pedagogy. And to make the most of shared reading experiences, you can share Merga's Read Aloud checklist with colleagues. Again, this is just something you can click on and access the PDF. Okay, so we covered all 10 strategies. These 10 strategies could seriously fuel a year or more of professional learning. As we see in chapter 2, there are so many individual research-backed practices for each of these key elements of transforming a school culture into a reading culture. But thinking about module 1, thinking about our conversation and the feedback that everyone provided on competing leisure pursuits, what little time kids have to read, I'd like to dive deeper into what we can do to help build or rebuild students' reading habits. A few weeks ago, one of my literacy heroes, I think it's Tia's as well, Colby Sharp, published this blog post. They are not reading as much as they normally do. And you can click on the link there and access the whole blog post. And in his blog post, he described how his fifth grade students seem to be reading less outside of school in years past. And so he reread one of his favorite teacher books of all time, Reading in the Wild by Donald Miller, and it reminded him of the importance of helping students develop their reading habits. And he dove back into the practice of conducting reading habits conferences, and he was thrilled with the results. Well, I had never heard of reading habits conferences, so I reached out to Colby and I asked him if I could record an interview with him to learn more to share with you all. And not only did Colby say yes, he asked me, do you want Donalyn to join us too? So obviously my answer was yes. I am thrilled to share with you our conversation. During the interview, please use the chat to share any of your reactions, thoughts, and insights. And after the interview, we'll have an opportunity to meet with our campfire crews and reflect on everything that we've learned about today. So enjoy, here we go. What motivated you to write the book?
Well, one thing that motivated me to write it was after the book Whisper, my first book came out, I got a lot of emails from teachers asking me things like, how do you assess student learning? And, how are you making sure they make progress? And how do you get grades? And a lot of really hard questions, Susie, about the nuts and bolts of a lot of assessment questions, honestly. And then the other thing, of course, that led me to just ask the questions that became Reading in the Wild were my students, because I would run into my students 6 months after they were in my class or a year later at Target, and they would walk towards me like I was the reading police. And they would admit to me that they weren't reading anything. Hello, Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry, I haven't read a book since I left your class. I'm like, why are you telling me this? This is not how I want to see you out in the world. And I started to ask a lot of questions about that because, I would run into kids who I knew were voracious readers in my class, but it seemed as if the minute that those support systems and that community went away, they went back to not reading again. And, it was as if we weren't creating independent readers in the class. We were creating dependent readers, and they were dependent on me. And once all of those supports were removed, they stopped reading. And I thought, well, who can help me with this? I thought I had some things figured out, but no, they're not reading. So I thought, okay, who has figured this out? And what I decided was adults who continue to engage in pleasure reading as a habit have learned quite a few things about how to sustain and maintain a reading habit in spite of all obstacles. And so this was, let's say, 2010, 2011, in the fledgling days of the internet. I think Colby and I may have just met when I was starting to work on Reading in the Wild. And I decided to do a Survey Monkey survey. Y'all remember Survey Monkey? And I decided to do this is way before Google Forms did it for us. I did a Survey Monkey survey called the Wild Reader Survey. And I sent it out through all my social media channels on Twitter, which I had a following on Twitter, and on Facebook. And of course, I was in grad school at the time. I sent it to all my colleagues in my grad school cohort. And I collected about 1,000 responses. I'm sure we would get many more now, Colby, if we did it again. But I just asked them questions about their reading lives. And the insight that they provided kind of helped me. And my friend Susie Kelly, who taught fifth grade at the time, Susie tried out some things in her fifth grade class while I was trying out things in my sixth grade class. And that really is what led us to Reading in the Wild. It was really in direct response to teachers' questions, and then what wild readers told me about the strategies that they employed in order to continue their reading habits in spite of any challenges.
Thank you. And when you think about, there's so many great strategies in that book. We're focusing today on the reading habits conferences. How have you found that reading habits conferences promote students' reading engagement?
When I came up with many of the forms, and if you're listening to this as a podcast, there are air quotes there while I'm saying it. When I created a lot of the forms, it's because I'm anti-form, but people kept asking me for forms, Susie. So I thought, okay, if I was going to create a form as an anti-form person, what would I want? So there's one piece of subversion there to the forms. But the other piece of it was all of the conference forms that I went looking for on the internet really seemed to be about probing kids' comprehension, which is important. I mean, we can't have them walking around with book props, not really reading anything. We need to know if they can understand the books they've chosen for independent reading. Or it seemed like kind of gotchas, like we're making kids march through a checklist of questions during that conferring opportunity. And I think about the National Council of Teachers of English definition of independent reading that urges us to remember that the goal of independent reading as an instructional practice is to build habitual readers with conscious reading identities. But it didn't seem like we were really, and when I say we, I mean the universal we as educators. I am including myself in that too. We spend a lot of time talking to kids about the outcomes of reading without really talking to them about what's going on inside them as readers. And if we want kids to have conscious reading identities, then we need to give them opportunities, and as adults, scaffold them towards considering their reading habits, their reading preferences, their own personal reading goals. Colby and I have talked about this many times. Often we consume kids with external reading goals, and kids have so many goals that reading doesn't really belong to them anymore. And so I think the Reading Habits Conference really came from those needs, wanting to really give kids an opportunity to reflect on their own reading habits. And in a way, the conference is always supposed to be more for the reader than it is for the teacher. And so it's about providing that opportunity for kids to have that time to reflect with the support of a mentor. And then it does, as a teacher, provide you an incredible amount of insight into how kids are starting to become intrinsically motivated to read.
Absolutely. And I would love to hear how that looks like in practice, what that looks like in practice. You know, Colby, I know this is something you just revisited with some of your students after noticing a decline in their recreational reading. So I'd just love to hear from you, like, what does that look like in practice, and kind of what was eye-opening about it, and what might next steps be with your readers?
Yeah. So the first time that I saw these reading habit conferences was when Donalyn was working on Reading in the Wild. She visited my school, and I was a fourth grade teacher at the time. And, I thought I knew my kids really good, and I thought had them all figured out. It was in the spring, and she pulled these out, and she sat with 3 or 4 kids. There was a kid named Ty. He's got to be like 20 years old now, which is wild. And I remember her sitting and talking with him, and kind of going through these different little boxes of the form, and just like listening to her talk to him, how much more I learned about him as a reader. And this year we have switched to a very scripted curriculum. It's my 18th year of teaching. I've never had to teach like this before. And I was definitely noticing that they weren't reading as much outside of school. But even like the vibe in class isn't the same. And over the summer, I read this book by Chip and Dan Heath called The Power of Moments. And in it, there's this quote. It says, "We run schools like a nonstop practice. You never get a game. Nobody would go out for a basketball team if you never had a game. What is the game for students?" And I was thinking about that with reading. Like, what is the game? Like, what is the whole point of all of this? And I think if like schools were really honest, I think the game would be the end of the year assessment. I really think that's the game. And I don't want to play that game. And for the first time, I felt like that's the game that like I've been assigned to play in a way. And so I was thinking, like, what can I do? Like, how can I got to figure this out. So I was thinking about those conferences that I used to do a lot more often. And this year we've been kind of like required to do certain things at certain times of the day. So I haven't been able to confer as much as I'd like. And I just decided that I'm just going to do these. I'm going to do these conferences. And I just sit with each kid and we look through the books that they've read this year. They think about how their engagement looks at home and in school. Look at the books they've abandoned, their reading plans, who are they getting book recommendations from. And what's been really interesting is I'm about halfway through the class in the last handful of days doing these and noticing, like, learning a ton about each individual kid, but also really noticing some trends in the class. For example, there's this section in the conference sheet that Donalyn reluctantly created for me and everyone else that says recommendations. And what's been fascinating talking with the kids is maybe one of them so far has mentioned getting book recommendations from other kids. It's almost all from series they've read, authors they've read, read alouds other teachers have done. And like that's a direct result in us not getting as much book talking in as we've done in the past. And so Friday we did some book talking, and honestly, Susie, it was like the most just energy we've had in this class at any time of the day, not just in reading. And they were just so happy. And they're like, can we do this every day? And I used to think, like, we used to do this almost every day. So it's been helpful for me to see, I guess, not just like what they're not doing well, but what I'm not doing well as a teacher and what I can emphasize more that will help them. So that's been really interesting to see the trends with the kids. But also like individual kids, but really the trends, the whole group stuff has been really eye-opening. Like, wow, I think you sent me a quote earlier this year, Donalyn, talking about like when we throw something new into the curriculum or something new that we have to do, we don't always, even if the test scores go up, we're not always thinking about what, you know what I'm talking about? Like, and is it worth what we're giving up? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I mean, in general, we can say when we're heavily focused on things like test prep, we know there's not, I mean, Susie can speak to this. There's not a body of research that shows that all that test prep actually leads to long-term reading performance for kids. I also am of the camp that rejects that reading as a performance in the first place. Terry Lassane and I wrote about this in our book, The Joy of Reading. Reading is transformative, not performative. And I think we've taken reading, something that really does transform the individual like almost nothing else does, and turned it into a performance. I mean, we've made kids into reading seals, you know, jumping through hoops. And if they do it in a certain way, then they're doing it the right way. I haven't had a chance to ask you any questions. Susie, can I ask Colby a question while we're doing this?
Yes.
We haven't had a chance to talk since you've been doing this, Colby, and I know you're still in the process, but I've been in your classroom many times, and of course, I've done this conference many times, and you and I have also created some surveys ourselves, and I'm always interested in how just asking questions can guide behavior. The question itself changes people's behavior. For example, if all of us were to take a nutrition quiz and one of the questions asked us about our fruit and vegetable intake, we would increase our fruit and vegetable intake for at least a few days just because we approached that question and kind of thought, I could probably do a little better job on that. So I'm curious, having talked with your students in this way for the first time this year using that protocol, have you already seen a change in behavior just because you've been talking about it with this way with kids? I mean, you haven't really had time, and you may not have the opportunity to make huge changes here based on some of the limitations you've described. But how is just the act of having these conversations with kids perhaps influence the culture already?
A couple of things. One, like I don't think they even thought to like get recommendations from each other. So that's been huge, just like asking them about that and then like talking to them about, well, I notice you read a lot of the same books as this person. Like, oh yeah, I do. I wonder what else they're reading. So seeing them think like that's a way to get recommendations. Also, when looking at like their reading preferences, doing this conference, like really celebrating when they have a preference. Because a lot of times if they've read like 25 or 30 graphic novels halfway through the year, I think they at time kids are made to think that that's a bad thing, but we're like celebrating that. Look, you love graphic novels. Isn't that amazing that you have found a type of book that you love? Look, you've read 15 historical fiction books this year. That's amazing. And instead of first thing being, let's try something else, like maybe you'll also like these historical fiction books. So I think they're feeling, the kids that I've been able to chat with, they're feeling better about themselves as readers. And they're starting to see other ways to find books and seeing each other as readers instead of just seeing themselves as readers.
Do you think, are you seeing them differently than you saw them before? They've been in your class for half a year now. Have you learned some things? You're pretty keyed into your students too. I know this about you. So have you learned some things about them during these conversations that you, and it doesn't have to be about reading, or do you feel like you've gotten to know them a little better? Have you gained some insight?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when talking to them about how reading's going outside of school and just really realizing how hard it is for kids to find that time. And it's so much, I think, trickier than it used to be. Like they are really busy
Mm-hmm.
and they have a lot of screens. And I'm not like anti-screen and I'm not like blaming screen. I definitely would want to check my screen time at certain weeks of the year. But I think it's really tricky to read outside of school and like trying to help them, like just thinking of ways to try to help them with that in a way that's not making reading at home like a school homework, but just something that they want to do. So really trying, like one of my friends, Emery, big Detroit Lion fan, so he's been really quite heartbroken the last couple of weeks. But he's like, he's every day I want to read. I love my book. I really want to read at home, but I just forget. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. So I'm like, why don't you bring your phone in? And let's set a reminder. Like, when would be a good time? It's like, well, 9 o'clock. I have to be in bed about that time. So he brought his phone in and we set up a reminder on his phone. So now every night when he's home, he gets a little reminder right before bed to remember to pull that book out. So trying to adapt to the times. And we've talked about this. You've talked about this, Donald, and you helped me to see this. Like, we know that reading is not going to be the number one priority for all of the kids. We're just looking for a seat at the table. Like, we just want them to see it as part of their lives. Like, would I love every kid to read a half hour a night? Yes. But if I can get these kids to read 5 minutes a night, that's huge. If I can get a kid to pull out their book and to think about reading at all, that's going to lead to reading being there for them when they want it, when they need it, when they seek it.
Well, we want it just for what my husband calls reading emergencies, right? It's the proximity to the reading material when the time emerges. That's what we're hoping will happen, that access and time will collide.
Yeah.
And that I think finding time to read for a lot of our kids, as we have learned, isn't so much a function of time either. It's a function of access. How can we ensure that they have something to read when the time appears? So if our kids are overscheduled, talking to families about carrying books in the car, those magazines. My grandkids are in such wide range of ages. It's tricky to find things that they will all read, but we get those fact books, National Geographic animal books, shove them in the back seat of the car. They'll all read animal facts to each other. So I think we just,
Your book.
yeah, exactly, Susie. So it's almost like we're doing a bit of occupational therapy, but the occupation is reader. And we are
Yeah.
just trying to help kids figure out how they can manage a reading habit. If the desire is there, how can we, because we can feed the desire, but we also have to help them with the logistics, with the nuts and
Mhm.
bolts of it. Okay, they want to read. Do they have library cards? Where are they getting books? How are they finding time to read? I wrote about this in Reading in the Wild. Kids just trying to find time to read, reading in the car, the kids who could read in the car, reading on the way to football practice, reading on the way home, just helping them find those little minutes of time. And that's a big part of the occupation of a reader, is just finding time to read, and then also having that access when the time appears.
Well, I love the phrase reading occupational therapy. It sounds like another blog post. And my favorite part of this is just creating that space for authentic student voice to guide our practice and guide how we support them with finding the time, finding the strategies to kind of just build their reader identities. So just thank you both again. What a treasure trove of wisdom. And from the entire state of Colorado, we are super grateful for you being a part of our session today. There we go. As you can tell, I had a hard time editing that because everything that came out of their mouths, I just so valued all of their words of wisdom, and they just had so many great ideas. So I hope you enjoyed that too. Now is actually my favorite part. This is our chance to talk with one another in small groups. We will have about 15 minutes for this discussion. Please start off your discussion by introducing yourselves, your role, and where you're from. And our campfire discussion prompt is share your reading strength for promoting reading engagement. So thinking back again to that list of 40 things, what did you put in the chat? What does that strength look like in practice, and what are the secrets to success? And I will paste the discussion prompt into the chat, and then you can copy it and paste it into your breakout session, just as a reference. Again, just like any book club discussion, if your conversation meanders, if it evolves into what your group needs, that's absolutely okay. And I will send out a message in 1 minute when we have 1 minute remaining. So I will get us started in groups in just a second here. Welcome back. Oh, this just flies by. I wish we had more time. I think I would have made this 90 minutes now that I'm in it. But I also know we all have very busy lives. And just with a few seconds that we have left, is there someone who would like to brag on someone in their breakout room about a strength of theirs that they shared around promoting reading engagement? And feel free to unmute.
Well, I'll go. My group talked about doing book talks and just how, possibly the idea of book clubs and but with book talks, I shared, how do you do book talks in a way that you have enough materials for people? So we talked about book tastings and book talking a genre instead of just a book, and things like that. So it was a great conversation. We got lots of good ideas.
Good. Thanks, Jen. Well, I know we are at the end of our time, so that wraps up today. Today we focused on the what, the research-backed practices that promote reading engagement. I'm going to drop a link into the chat of our reflection and evaluation form. If you'll be requesting 5 continuing ed contact hours for participating in the book study, please complete the entire reflection form. At the very least, please use the form to complete the program evaluation in section 2. There are just a few questions. It's my state library report card, and we share that feedback with our federal funders. So I really appreciate that. And I'd like to end today with this quote by Donalyn Miller: teaching our students to be wild readers is not only possible, it is our ethical responsibility. Our students deserve it, society demands it, and our teaching hearts know that it matters. So may you take that with you. Thank you for all you do for your students. And I hope to see you in our next live session, and we'll start diving into the how of how to build your reading teen coalition. Good night, everyone. Thank you.